Preface. This video is recorded according to Foton Cummins ISF 3.8 Engine Maintenance Manual. Although data and technical specifications listed in this course should be used for training only. Look up the service manual on QuickServe online for the latest information. This video teaching materials on ISF 3.8 engine overhaul is mainly used for the training of ISF 3.8 engine servicemen. With this video, you will quickly and accurately get familiar with Foton Cummins ISF 3.8 series engines in terms of repair and assembly processes and technical requirements, so as to bring your repairing skills to a new high. This course is suitable for those mechanical servicemen of engine who has 3 years of repair experience or longer. Apprentices need to be guided by experienced technicians for watching and learning. In the actual repair practice, please refer to technical specifications and standards and use the required tools so as to provide customers with standard repair services. Operation notices. Before repairing or operating the engine, please abide by the following recommended practices. Always wear goggles and safety shoes. Remove earrings, watch, long jewelry or metal objects. In case of feeling tired because of drugs or alcohol, or in case of feeling discomfort, don't work on the equipment. Be sure to use the correct and intact tools. Check and calibrate them periodically. While working on electrical components, be careful, because high voltage will cause the personal casualty. Before removing or disconnecting pipe fittings or related items, release the system pressure as required. Do not move any part weighing 23 kilograms or above. Always abide by the technical specifications. Tighten the pipe fittings and connectors. Over-tightening or under-tightening may result in a thread damage and leakage. Fasteners should be replaced with the ones with the same part number or equivalent. Ensure that the product is always properly supported by brackets or stands. No working with a product supported by a jack alone or crane alone. Clean up the operation site and ensure it is clean and tidy without any dust and debris. Key components and systems of the engine should be properly protected. Fixing and subassembly of cylinder block. Fixing and subassembly of cylinder block. Required tools: rollover stand, steel ruler with aluminum handle, feeler gauge 0.02 to 1.00 millimeters, internal dial indicator kit, torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Fix cylinder block onto the rollover stand. Clean all sealing and mounting planes of cylinder block and wipe them clean with non-woven fabrics. Check cylinder block for crack, corrosion, burr or damage. Clean engine oil and coolant passages. Dry them with compressed air. Use the feeler gauge and ruler to check cylinder block plainness. Difference on both sides should not exceed 0.051 millimeters. Difference between front and rear end should not exceed 0.076 millimeters. If the cylinder block plainness is out of tolerance, replace it. Use internal dial indicator to measure the bore at 4 points spaced by 90 degrees at the top, middle and the bottom of piston. A cylinder bore diameter should be within 102.010 to 102.030 millimeters. The viewing depth shall not exceed 0.038 millimeters. The taper shall not exceed 0.076 millimeters. Install 2 annular dowel pins on the front end of cylinder block. Remove the main bearing covers. Put aside orderly according to mark. Installation of tappet. Check the tappet for excessive wear, crack and other defects. Lubricate tappet with clean oil. If camshaft and tappet are to be reused, proper marks should be made. The one without mark should not be reused. Note: a new camshaft shall not be equipped with any old tappet. Installation of camshaft. Tools for installation of camshaft. Dial gauge, dial indicator with magnetic base, bracket torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Check if camshaft and bushing surfaces are not scratched or oil stained. Use clean oil to lubricate camshaft, bushing journal roller and thrust washer. While gently pushing the camshaft, rotate it carefully until it passes through the camshaft bushing. Note that the camshaft shall not be impacted. Do not push the camshaft into the camshaft hole forcibly. Otherwise, the camshaft assembly will be damaged. Install the camshaft thrust plate. Tighten bolts to 24 nanometers. Check if the camshaft rotates flexibly. Check the axial clearance of camshaft. Axial clearance 0.20 plus or minus 0.13 millimeters. Installation of piston cooling nozzle. Tools for installation of piston cooling nozzle. Quick drying spray detergent. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Clean and check piston cooling nozzle. Ensure that the nozzle is not clogged or deformed. Install the nozzle. Ensure the dowel pin is seated correctly. Tighten bolts to 50 nanometers. Check if there is any oil cooling nozzle uninstalled. Installation of crankshaft. Use non-woven fabrics to clean upper shell base, shell surface and back of main shaft. Ensure they are free of any scratch or burr. Assemble according to the mark. Ensure the bearing shell is flush with its base at both sides. The locating boss of upper bearing shell should sit in the positioning groove of the shell base. The oil hole of upper bearing shell should be aligned with the one on the shell base. The shell surface should be coated with clean engine oil. Note: the fourth bearing base and shell back should not be oiled. Do not install the fourth thrust bearing at this time. Clean all oil passages of crankshaft and dry it with compressed air. Clean crankshaft mounting surface with non-woven fabrics. Check the crankshaft appearance for any impact, scratch, blister and rust. Hoist the crankshaft. Install crankshaft onto the engine block. With its small head on the front end of the engine block, lubricate each journal of crankshaft with clean engine oil. Clean the thrust bearing shaft surface with non-woven fabrics. Then, lubricate with clean oil. Install the thrust bearing shell to the fourth shell base and rotate the crankshaft slightly until the clearances at both ends of the shell cover are similar to each other. Then, push into the thrust bearing shell. While rotating the crankshaft with one hand facing the operator along the shaft rotating direction, push the shell into its base with the other hand. Note: the lettered side of thrust bearing shell should face the intake side. The location boss of thrust bearing shell should sit in the locating groove of bearing shell base. Check if both ends of all shells are flush respectively. Installation of main bearing. Tools used for the installation of main bearing: shock absorbing rubber hammer, torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers, torque wrench 200 to 1000 nanometers, angular scale, dial indicator with magnetic base, bracket. Clean the cover and lower shell of main bearing with non-woven fabrics. Carefully check if they are impacted, scratched or have other foreign materials. Install the lower shell of main bearing. Ensure that lower shell is seated correctly in its positioning groove with both ends of bearing shell and base flush respectively. If the used bearing shell is to be reinstalled, proper marks should be made during disassembly. Lubricate the shell surface with a clean oil. Then, install the main bearing cover. Ensure that its annular dowel pin is seated correctly. Note that the chambered end of main bearing cover should face the exhaust side. The bearing cover matches the bearing shell base in terms of positions and directions. Use clean oil to lubricate the main bearing cover at both threads. Then install the bolts. Use a rubber hammer to gently tap the bearing cover until it is closely fitted with the bearing base. In the way of diagonally from the center to both sides, tighten the bolts. Tightening torque. Firstly, tighten them to 70 nanometers. Secondly, rotate them by 100 degrees. Note: while tightening the main bearing bolt to the final torque, check frequently if the crankshaft rotates freely. Check axial play of crankshaft. Axial clearance 0.11 to 0.39 millimeters. Installation of front gear chamber cover assembly. Tools used for the installation of front gear chamber cover: torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers, P80 lubricant, replacement tools for front oil seal, Camshaft oil seal installer. Turn the crankshaft to the top dead center TDC of number 1 to number 4 cylinders. Install the new gasket onto front gear chamber. Note: while installing the front gear chamber cover gasket, don't damage the rubber at the bottom edge of gasket. Check if any part of front gear chamber cover is scratched, cracked or worn, and if its bolt is loosened. Installation of front gear chamber cover. Note: the oil pump gear should not be aligned with the crankshaft gear. Install the bolts. Tighten them in sequence. 3 long bolts should be installed in position 1 as shown in the figure. For 14 and 12, torque to 24 nanometers. Remove any oil seal residue out of front gear chamber cover seal hole. Check if front gear chamber cover seal hole is scratched or burnt. Check if front end of crankshaft is worn severely. Lubricate the sealing surface evenly with P80. With a guide tooling, press the brand new front oil seal of crankshaft evenly into the oil seal hole. Then, use special tools to evenly press the oil seal into the front gear chamber cover. Clean and lubricate the sealing surface of camshaft seal hole. Install a new camshaft seal into the front gear chamber cover. Manually press the oil seal evenly into its mounting hole. Use special tooling to push the oil seal into its hole evenly until the correct depth. Note that the oil seal should be installed until 12 mm depth in its hole. Installation of rear gear chamber. Tools used for the installation of rear gear chamber. Sealant, torque wrench 20 to 100 nanometers. Check if the rear gear chamber is leaked or has other defects. Clean the accessory-driven oil supply hole with its trajectory shown in the figure. Gear chamber cover at the engine block side should be coated with a circle of sealant 1.5 to 2.0 mm wide. Note: gear chamber should be installed in 10 minutes after gluing. Otherwise, the sealant will malfunction. Install rear gear chamber. Tighten its bolt in sequence to 77 nanometers for M12 bolts, to 47 nanometers for M10 bolts, to 24 nanometers for M8 bolts. Installation of crankshaft pulley. Tools used for the installation of crankshaft pulley. Crank, torque wrench 40 to 200 nanometers. Check the crankshaft pulley for any tooth lost, crack or other defects. Check if the wheel hub is cracked. Install the crankshaft pulley onto the crankshaft. Be sure to align the dowel pin correctly with the part number facing outwards. Lubricate the bolts with clean engine oil. Tighten them in sequence. Note: crankshaft must be fixed with a crank. Tightening torque. Step 1. Torque to 55 nanometers. Step 2. Rotated by 90 degrees. Installation of camshaft gear. Tools used for the installation of camshaft gear. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Check if the camshaft gear is scratched, cracked or worn severely, or if any tooth lost. Install the camshaft gear onto the camshaft. Note the alignment of positive shape marks. Ensure the positive shape mark on camshaft gear is aligned with the one on the crankshaft gear. Install the camshaft gear screws and then tighten them to 36 nanometers. Install the breather disc onto the camshaft gear. Install and tighten the 2 mounting bolts to 28 nanometers. Subassembly of piston and connecting rod. Tools used for the subassembly of piston and connecting rod. Piston ring expander. Circlip pliers. Clean the piston with non-woven fabrics. Check if the piston ring groove is clean with any burr. Use the piston ring expander to install the piston ring into the piston. Firstly, install the oil ring. Secondly, install the black gas ring. Finally, install the silver white gas ring. Note: before installation, top mark of piston ring should face the piston top. Check that the piston ring rotates smoothly, and if not, please replace it immediately. Use non-woven fabrics to clean the piston pin hole, and connecting rod pin hole. Check them for any bump, scratch or burr. If the used piston pin is to be reinstalled as well as the connecting rod and its bearing, proper marks should be made during this assembly so as to reinstall them to their original position. The piston pin, its hole and connecting rod pinhole should be coated with a layer of clean oil. Assemble the piston and connecting rod. Note: Ensure that large head of connecting rod should be flush with the notched side of piston skirt. The piston pinhole in the connecting rod should be aligned with the pinhole on the piston. Install the piston pin and positioning circlip into their ring groove. Be careful not to install any used piston pin snap ring. Before installation, check if the piston pin rotates smoothly. Wipe the upper and lower shells and their bases of connecting rod with non-woven fabrics. Check them for any bump, scratch and burr. Note: if the used connect rod bearing shell is to be reinstalled, proper marks should be made during disassembly so as to reinstall it to its original position. Install the connecting rod bearing shell. Ensure the shell sits correctly in the positioning groove, with the bearing shell and base flush with each other at both sides. Lubricate the connecting rod bearing shell surface with clean oil, but the shell back cannot be oiled. Assembling of piston and connecting rod assembly. Tools used for the installation of piston and connecting rod assembly: guide pin, piston ring compressor, filler gauge 0.02 to 1.00 mm, torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers, dial gauge and its base. Crank the crankshaft until the connecting rod journal to be installed reaches the bottom dead center (BDC). Use non-woven fabrics to clean the journal inside of cylinder hole, piston and inside of piston ring compressor. Use clean engine oil to lubricate the piston ring, piston skirt, crankshaft journal, inside of cylinder hole and inside of piston ring compressor. Install the guide tooling. The connecting rod should not touch the cylinder bore. The arrow mark on top of piston should be aligned and should face the front of engine. At this time, the long end of connecting rod and the piston skirt notch should be aligned with the engine exhaust side and cannot be installed incorrectly. Ensure the openings of adjacent piston rings should be spaced by 120 degrees and should be not at the piston pin axis. Compress the piston ring with piston ring compressor. Install the piston pin according to its mark. Before installation, if the piston pin cannot move freely, remove it and check if it is broken or damaged. Lubricate the connecting rod bearing shell surface with clean engine oil. Follow the marks to install the connecting rod cover onto the original connecting rod. Tightening torque. Firstly, tighten it to 60 nanometers. Secondly, rotate it by 60 degrees. Check the connecting rod clearance. Connecting rod clearance 0.125 millimeters to 0.275 millimeters. Measure the piston protrusion with a dial indicator. Rotate the crankshaft to the top dead center, TDC. Rotate the crankshaft counterclockwise and clockwise. Find the maximum reading of dial indicator. The piston protrusion should be within 0.151 to 0.485 millimeters. Check if the arrow on the top of piston faces the front end of engine and if the crankshaft rotates freely. Installation of reinforcement plate. Tools used for the installation of reinforcement plate: torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Clean the reinforcement plate with non-woven fabrics. Check the reinforcement plate for crack and other defects. Install the steel reinforcement plate onto the cylinder block. Ensure the reinforcement plate type and location are correct. For large reinforcement plate, the side with part number should face upwards and the exhaust side. For small reinforcement plate, the side with part number should face upwards and the front end of engine. Sequentially, tighten the bolts crosswise from the center to the outside. Tightening torque 43 nanometers. Installation of oil sump. Tools used for the installation of oil sump: torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Sealant. Interface between cylinder block and rear gear chamber, as well as the trapezoidal interface between the engine block and front cover, should be coated with a layer of sealant 3 to 4 millimeters wide. Glue line must be uniform and continuous. Note: oil sump should be installed within 5 minutes after gluing and should be tightened within 15 minutes. Check if the oil sump and gasket are clean without any crack. Install the oil sump. Note: oil sump must be marked during disassembly to avoid mis-reassembly. Tighten the bolts crosswise from the center to both sides. Tightening torque 24 nanometers. Clean and check the threads and sealing surface of oil drain plug. Before installing the oil drain plug, lubricate it with clean engine oil. Install and tighten the oil sump drain plug. Tightening torque 24 nanometers. Note: don't over-tighten the oil drain plug. Over-tightening will damage the oil sump and its drain plug. Installation of the engine cooling module. Tools used for the installation of engine cooling module. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Install a new gasket. Clean and check the oil cooler. Ensure its cleaning surface is not cracked. Check if the coolant rotates freely without any stuck phenomenon. Install the engine cooling module. Tighten the bolts shown in figure to 27 nanometers. Check if the oil filter is not cracked and if the sealing ring is installed in place. Note: genuine oil filter must be used. Use clean oil to coat a layer of oil onto the oil filter gasket. Fill the filter with clean oil. Avoid damaging to the engine due to lack of lubrication at startup. Install the filter onto its base. Tighten it manually until the gasket touches the filter base surface. After that, further tighten it by one cycle. Subassembly of cylinder head. Tools used for the subassembly of cylinder head. Valve spring compressor. Steel ruler with aluminum handle. Feeler gauge 0.02 to 1.00 millimeters. Torque wrench 20 to 100 nanometers. Clean and check the cylinder head for any crack or wear. Check the cylinder head plainness with the feeler gauge and ruler. Plainness between front and rear ends should be less than 0.305 millimeters. Plainness between left and right ends should be less than 0.076 millimeters. Clean and check its parts for any scratch, wear or other defects. Install the valves. There are pits on the exhaust valve end face but intake valve doesn't have. Note: proper marks should be made during the disassembly of intake and exhaust valve so as to install them to their original position. Install the valve oil seal, valve spring retainer, and the valve collet. Use the valve spring compressor to compress the valve spring. Note: it is a must to use a new valve collet. After assembly, tap the valve stem with a plastic hammer to ensure that the valve collet is seated correctly. Check and install the front and rear lugs of engine onto the engine heads. Tighten the bolt to 63 nanometers. Installation of cylinder head. Tools used for the installation of cylinder head. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Torque wrench 200 to 1000 nanometers. Angular scale. Mount the two-cylinder head dowel pin. Torque to 24 nanometers. Check if the cylinder block top is clean without any dirt. Wipe the cylinder block top from inside to outside with non-woven fabrics. Check the cylinder head gasket and ensure it is intact and clean. It is a must to use a new cylinder head gasket. The dowel pinhole on the cylinder head gasket should be aligned with the annular dowel pin. Install the cylinder head gasket onto the top of engine block. Use the hoisting rigging to slowly seat the cylinder head onto the cylinder block dowel pin. Use clean oil to lubricate the cylinder head screw heads. Install screws and tighten them manually and in the sequence shown in the figure. Tightening torque. Firstly, tighten the screws to 60 nanometers. Secondly, torque again to 60 nanometers. Thirdly, rotate them by 90 degrees clockwise. Fourthly, further rotate them by 90 degrees. Installation of rocker assembly. Tools used for the installation of rocker assembly. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers and angular scale. Check if the push rod is worn, scratched or has other defects. Lubricate the ball hand with clean oil. Install the push rod into the valve tappet jack. Note: push rod must be installed in its original position and orientation and in place. Check if the push rod is installed in place. Lubricate the ball socket and valve top. Clean the valve jumper clamp. Check if it is cracked and worn excessively. install the jumper clamp according to its mark. Ensure it is installed to its original position with new large head facing the exhaust side. Sequentially lubricate the contact surface between the jumper clamp and rocker contact pad. Check the rocker assembly. Ensure that the rocker contact pad is not cracked or severely worn and that the contact pad could move smoothly on its rocker. The rocker shaft and its hole should not be cracked or severely worn. Mount the rocker assembly in the original position. Tighten the bolts manually. Tighten the rocker mounting bolts. Tightening torque. Firstly, torque to 18 nanometers. Secondly, rotate them by 45 degrees. Adjustment of valve clearance. Tools used for the adjustment of valve clearance. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Crank, feeler gauge 0.02 to 1.00 millimeters. Adjust the engine timing. Rotate the crankshaft with the crank until the TDC mark of crankshaft pulley faces right upwards and both rockers of number 1 cylinder are loosened. Fix the crankshaft. Now, this is the compression top dead center TDC of number 1 cylinder. Intake valve clearance plus or minus 0.33 millimeters, plus or minus 0.5 millimeters. Exhaust valve clearance 0.58 millimeters plus or minus 0.05 millimeters. No, only when engine coolant temperature stays at 60 degrees Celsius or below can the valve clearance be adjusted. At the compression TDC of number 1 cylinder, check or adjust the intake valve clearance of number 1 cylinder, exhaust valve clearance of number 1 cylinder, intake valve clearance of number 2 cylinder, and exhaust valve clearance of number 3 cylinder. Turn the crankshaft by 360 degrees with the crank. Adjust the engine to number 4 cylinder compression TDC and check or adjust the exhaust valve clearance of number 2 cylinder, intake valve clearance of number 3 cylinder, intake valve clearance of number 4 cylinder, and exhaust valve clearance of number 4 cylinder. Adjusting method. Insert the feeler gauge between the jumper clamp and the rocker support to measure the clearance. If clearance measured value is out of the technical range, loosen the lock nut. Adjust the clearance to the nominal technical range. Tighten the lock nut. Measure the valve clearance again. No. While the feeler gauge slides between the jumper clamp and contact pad, if you feel some resistance, it means the clearance is correct. Fix the adjusting bolt. Tighten the lock nut to 24 nanometers. Installation of intake manifold. Tools used for the installation of intake manifold. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Torque wrench 5 to 25 nanometers. Part number 96422. Clean and check the intake port of cylinder head for dirt and damage. Install the new intake manifold gasket onto the cylinder head. Note, the side with glue line should face outwards. The end marked with the part number should face upwards. Check the intake manifold for crack and other damages. Install the intake manifold. Tighten its bolts in sequence to 24 nanometers. Install the intake heater in correct direction. Torque to 5 nanometers. Install the coolant temperature sensor. Torque to 20 nanometers. Install the intake temperature and pressure sensor. Torque to 1.5 nanometers. Check the fuel rail inlet and outlet for any dirt or debris. If so, clean them with contact detergent. Install the high-pressure fuel rail assembly. Tighten its bolts manually. Installation of fuel injector. Tools used for the installation of fuel injector. Contact detergent. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Check if the fuel injector tip is carbonized or corroded. Check if a solenoid valve terminal is damaged. Check if the fuel injector inlet and high pressure connector are damaged. If a used fuel injector is to be installed, proper marks should be made during this assembly, so as to install it to its original position. Ensure the O-ring is on the fuel injector. Lubricate the O-ring. Remove the fuel injector nozzle cap. Install the fuel injector into the cylinder head with the fuel injector inlet facing the intake side. Note that the copper gasket of fuel injector cannot be omitted. It is a must to use a copper gasket. The fuel injector inlet cap cannot be removed. Install fuel injector in place with proper tools. Tighten the fuel injector holder bolts manually. Install the high-pressure fuel supply pipe of fuel injector. Tighten the end connectors of both fuel injector and fuel rail in sequence. Tighten the fuel injector holder bolts to 40 nanometers. Note: while tightening the bolts, keep the fuel injector moveless. Sequentially remove and protect the high-pressure fuel supply pipe. Install the fuel injector actuator and solenoid valve. Tighten the nuts. Installation of rocker chamber cover. Tools used for the installation of rocker chamber cover. Torque wrench 5 to 25 nanometers. Check if the sealing strip of rocker chamber cover is clean and intact. Any cracked sealing strips should be replaced. Install the sealing gasket onto the rocker chamber cover. Check if it is installed in place. Install the rocker chamber cover. Tighten the bolt sequentially. Tightening torque 9 nanometers. Installation of high-pressure fuel supply pipe. Tools used for the installation of high-pressure fuel supply pipe. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Special socket wrench for high-pressure fuel pipe. Check if fuel supply pipe is bent, cracked or damaged. If a used fuel supply pipe is installed, proper marks should be made during this assembly so as to install it to its original position. Remove the fuel rail outlet connector cap, as well as caps at both ends of fuel injector supply pipe. Install the fuel injector supply pipe. Step 1. Tighten the supply pipe connector at the fuel injector end by hand. Ensure the fuel pipe is in the middle of the nut. Step 2. Tighten the fuel supply pipe connector at the fuel rail end by hand. Ensure the fuel pipe is in the middle of the nut. Step 3. Tighten the fuel supply pipe nuts at the fuel injector end to 22 nanometers. Step 4. Tighten the fuel supply pipe nuts at the rail end to 22 nanometers. For the Red 3 pipelines, repeat this process. Note: the connectors should be tightened to the specified torques with a torque wrench. Under-tightening may lead to fuel leakage. Over-tightening may damage the fuel pipe. Check the high-pressure injector supply pipe seals in the rocker cover. Ensure that they, during the assembly of fuel injector supply pipe, are not damaged. Tighten 2 fuel rail bolts to 24 nanometers. Installation of fuel pump. Tools used for the installation of fuel pump. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Torque wrench 40 to 200 nanometers. Crank. Special socket wrench for high-pressure gasoline pipe or fuel rail. Check if the drive gear, seal ring, gear chamber, oil pump mounting hole and mounting stud are cracked or damaged. Any damaged one shall be replaced. Install the fuel pump onto the gear chamber. Install the fuel pump nuts and tighten them to 25 nanometers. Install the drive gear onto its drive shaft with their pinholes flush with each other. Note: it is unnecessary to perform the timing of both high-pressure fuel pump and crankshaft. Install the drive shaft lock nuts and washers. Tighten them manually. Fix the drive gear in place with the fixing tool. Meanwhile, tighten the driving gear fixing nuts to 105 nanometers. Check if high-pressure fuel rail supply pipe is cracked or bent and if its sealing surfaces at both ends are damaged. Connect the fuel pipe to the high-pressure fuel pump outlet and to the fuel rail inlet. Ensure the fuel pipe is in the middle of nut. Tighten the nuts at both ends of fuel rail supply pipe to 22 nanometers. Install the fuel rail supply pipe bracket. Tighten the screws to 21 nanometers. Note: ensure that no fuel pipe rubs against any other part. Installation of fuel filter. Tools used for the installation of fuel filter. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Install the fuel filter base onto the cylinder block. Tighten the 3 fixing bolts to 24 nanometers. Check if the fuel filter is not cracked or damaged. Note, it is prohibited to pre-add the fuel into its filter. Install the filter onto its base. Tighten the filter until the gasket ring touches the filter base surface. Note, it is a must to use genuine fuel filter. After contacting, tighten the fuel filter further by 3/4 cycle. Torque to 23 nanometers. Remove the fuel pump and the inlet and outlet connector caps of fuel filter. Ensure the inlet and outlet are free of oil stain. Connect the short low pressure fuel pipe to the gear pump outlet connector and to the filter inlet connector. Connect the long low pressure fuel pipe to the high pressure fuel pump inlet connector and to the filter outlet connector. Installation of fuel return pipe. Tools used for the installation of fuel return pipe. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Install the fuel return pipe connector or fuel injector onto the rear end of cylinder head. The gasket cannot be omitted. Torque to 24 nanometers. Install the fuel return connector onto the fuel pump. Install the fuel rail return pump. According to the recorded during this assembly pipeline layout method, install the fuel return pipe. Installation of flywheel housing. Tools used for the installation of flywheel housing. Loctite 509, torque wrench 40 to 200 nanometers. Clean and check the flywheel housing. The mounting surface should be evenly coated with Loctite 509 with glue width 2 to 3 millimeters. The glue line must be continuous without any breakpoint. If so, the glue line needs to be made up. Warning: if the assembly is not finished in 5 minutes after gluing, or if the tightening is not completed in 15 minutes after gluing, remove the sealant and repeat the gluing again. The well-glued flywheel housing is installed onto the rear end face of the cylinder block along the guide pin. Note: during installation, flywheel housing can scour or shake on the cylinder end face so as to protect the coated surface. Tighten the bolts in sequence to 49 nanometers for M10 bolts and to 85 nanometers for M12 bolts. Installation of rear oil seal and flywheel. Tools used for the installation of rear oil seal and flywheel. Tools to replace rear axle seal. Torque wrench 40 to 200 nanometers and angular scale. Clean and lubricate rear oil seal mounting hole of crankshaft. Use the guide tooling to evenly press the brand new rear oil seal of crankshaft into the oil seal hole. Then use special tools to evenly press rear oil seal in place until front end of the tool is flush with the rear end face of crankshaft. Install the flywheel onto the crankshaft gear. Tighten the bolts in sequence. Tightening torque. Firstly, tighten them to 30 nanometers. Secondly, rotate them by 90 degrees. Installation of thermostat. Tools used for the installation of thermostat. Torque wrench 5 to 25 nanometers. P80 rubber lubricant. Clean and check if the thermostat appearance is damaged, cracked or attached with debris. In case of any damage, the thermostat must be replaced. Install the thermostat onto its base. Note: its dowel pin should be seated correctly. If the used thermostat is to be reinstalled, a new gasket must be replaced with. Install the coolant outlet joint. Tighten its bolts to 9.5 nanometers. Check if the bypass coolant pipe is not cracked, notched, or has other defects. Use P80 rubber lubricant to lubricate the thermostat and 2 bypass coolant pipe joints on the engine cooling module. Note that a new O-shape must be used. Insert one end of the bypass coolant pipe into the engine cooler mounting hole, the other end into the thermostat mounting hole. Tighten the bypass coolant pipe bolts to 24 nanometers. Install the intake pipe connector. Tighten its micro clamp to 10 nanometers. Installation of exhaust manifold. Tools used for the installation of exhaust manifold. Torque wrench 20 to 100 nanometers. Check if the exhaust manifold, its bolt and spacer are not cracked or damaged. If the used exhaust manifold is to be reinstalled, remove the soot of the sealing surface between the exhaust manifold and the cylinder head exhaust port. The exhaust manifold bolts threads should be coated with a layer of high-temperature anti-binder. Install the exhaust manifold new gasket, spacer and collet. Note, it is a must to use a new exhaust manifold gasket. Install the exhaust manifold and screws. Tighten them in the sequence shown in figure to 53 nanometers. Installation of turbocharger. Tools for the installation of turbocharger. Torque wrench 5 to 25 nanometers. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Check if the turbocharger inlet and outlet pipes and gaskets are clean, intact, or not damaged. Install a new turbocharger gasket. Note, the side with part number should face outwards. Install the turbocharger. Tighten its 4 fasteners to 27 nanometers. Install the gasoline supply pipe onto the oil passage joint at the cylinder block pipe connector and onto the turbocharger bearing housing. Note, it is needed to use new sealing ring and O-ring. Torque to 28 nanometers. Push the fuel return pipe into its boss. Ensure 2 brand new O-rings completely sit in the hole. Install the oil dipstick. Torque to 9.5 nanometers. Installation of accessories. Tools used for the installation of accessories. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Torque wrench 20 to 100 nanometers. Install the generator bracket onto the cylinder block. Tighten the bolts to 45 nanometers. Install the fan belt tensioner. Tighten the bolts to 43 nanometers. Install the generator. Tighten the bolts to 65 nanometers. Install the belt driving fan hub. Tighten the bolts to 33 nanometers. Install the idler pulleys. Torque to 43 nanometers. Install the fan pulley and tighten its bolts to 44 nanometers. Install the starter. Tighten the bolts to 80 nanometers. Installation of harnesses. Check and fix the engine harnesses. Install the camshaft position sensor harness connector. Install the crankshaft speed sensor harness connector. Install the coolant temperature sensor harness connector. Install the fuel injector harness connector. Install the intake manifold temperature and pressure sensor connector. Install the oil pressure sensor connector. Install the fuel rail pressure sensor harness connector. Install the fuel pump actuator harness connector. Note, ensure that no harness interferes with any other components. Inspection. After assembly, check if each system of engine is not installed or is mounted wrongly. Check if the fuel pipeline is connected reliably. Check if a harness connector is not connected in place. If the ECM is replaced, calibrate the new one.